Yes.
and then you mentioned kind of the effects of COVID. Um,
Yes.
People still feeling that, and I would love to dive into both of those subjects. Maybe talking about COVID because I don't, it's such an interesting thing to me because obviously it originated in China, so we you hear a lot. Oh, it's the virus came from China, which it did come from China, but like you know, uh,
Wuhan virus.
right. And I don't think people. It was almost like we were seeing it on the news, and it was in China. It was really bad, and then just like it was gone. It felt like China had just finished it, and I think people didn't understand that like it was still going on for in China for a while. So I mean, could you just give some kind of inside perspective about what that? I mean, were you even in China for COVID?
Well, for me personally, it's a very, very, very unpleasant thing. And I was in China during part of the COVID lockdown. And in China nowadays, people are talking the COVID period as the 3 special years because the Chinese government has started their lockdown and zero COVID policy from the beginning of 2020, and it had been continued for 3 years till the abolishment of this zero of any kind of variation of zero COVID policy, which means the zero COVID policy had been lasted for 3 years, and therefore the name 3 years period was given to dedicate the COVID pandemic in China.
Wait,
And it's very
three
different.
3 year
Yes,
period?
yes.
How come? Oh wait, because the lockdown
3 years special period.
because the
I'm
lockdowns.
translating that from
Right,
Chinese.
right, but the lockdowns were lifted. Explain to me again why it's called the 3 year period.
Oh, yes. It is because there were zero COVID policies. And for the reason why I use a plural form, because it is not one type of policy. In the beginning of 2020 and also in 2021, the, well, not only the government, but also people like me believed that the COVID can be contained. And it can be contained by very strict method of quarantine, mass tests, etc. It just can be contained. But afterwards, after those variations of um, the bacteria, people started to think, well, it's getting more and more common, like normal flu, not normal. Get they just for people who had COVID, they just feel like they had a very bad cold, and it's just very hard for them to realize they do need to quarantine themselves, and it's getting harder and harder for the government to contain the spread of COVID. And therefore, they started some variation of zero COVID policy, for instance, to make sure there are zero increase in one city in one day, or to make sure there are zero reports of new quarantine members in one city in one day. It's just like rhetoric things to massage with the figures. And therefore, the zero COVID policy has been interpreted and reinterpreted in many, many different ways till the very end. Till the very end. I cannot exactly recall when that is, but it's it's around 2023 or 2000. Uh, it's around the end of 2003 when the central government, when Peking officially decided we should end the any containment of COVID. We're just going to end quarantine. We're just going to end massive tests. And then suddenly, boom, no quarantine, no test whatsoever. There, people do not talk about COVID anymore. People just not afraid of COVID anymore. And hence, there had been 3 years of the practice of zero COVID policies. And therefore, nowadays, people in China are using the title three special years to nominate, denote the COVID eras.
And
The COVID era, I should say.
so kind of talk to me about what the impact was on people's, not just their health and whatever, but also their behaviors and their attitudes about life and their mental health and their mental states. Like, talk to me about
Of
how that
course.
changed kind of the way of life in China. Or I mean, again, I keep saying in China, and that's a little bit of like, I know it's wrong to say that because you're one.
Everything's
It,
connected with everything else.
yeah, and it's a huge country. You know, it's again, um, you're in Nanjing. You know, you're not in Shanghai. You're not in
Yeah.
Beijing. You're not in Tibet. So it's going to vary region to region. But again, you know, about your experience and what you know and what you feel. Apologize to the viewers if I keep on saying, you know, China writ large, China generally, and just assuming that Anshin is the representative to speak on everybody in China. That's not what I'm trying to
No, no.
imply. And I recognize there's epistemic um, fallacies or errors in that logic. So anyway, Anshin, continue.
Thank you very much for the clarifications. And also, like, I think when you speak of the mental health and people's um, just people's mental health in general, it's also closely linked with your two previous topics, like celebration of Christmas and Chinese New Year. But in the summary, I think people are more, first of all, people are more feeling, there's a feeling, I would say, there's a feeling of angst, and there is a feeling of depressed. And I would like to, and those feeling of angst and depressed closely linked to people's um, change of behaviors. For instance, do not, try not to celebrate Chinese New Year in a traditional way. And I would explain that. I will go back to the Chinese New Year when I will explain the impact of the mental impact, psychological impact. I'm not talking about any political like or any social impact. It's first of all, I just mentioned that it's fear. It is really the lockdown and the quarantine, the very strict lockdown and quarantine and massive test has a huge impact on people's understanding of liberty and understanding of demand. It's because, well, we Chinese just naturally, I don't say naturally, but a priori have the understanding of liberty a priori different from yours. So there were further restrictions. For instance, cannot go out of your neighborhood, cannot even go out of a building, or cannot even go one step out of your apartment door or your, well, in China, most people live in apartment rather than US, probably houses, etc. They're just strict restrictions on individual liberties. And also, people got some food delivered during lockdown rather than go shopping them. We have some kind of social organizations try to deliver food to those people in quarantine. And even when those people are not in quarantine, it's very hard for them to buy food and Lebensmittel. I don't know how to say Lebensmittel in English, like the necessary living materials,
Like living
like
materials,
clothes.
living materials,
Yeah, just living materials, including clothes and those very
supplies,
necessary
and
things,
like, yeah.
supplies. Yes, it's very hard for them to get from free market because most of the market were closed due to quarantine. And also, if you buy them from, if you use online shopping, it's very hard for you to get your parcel delivered. Also due to quarantine and restrictions, parcel needs also to be clear and first cleaned and second cleared, cleared by special organizations and cleaned with alcohol or cleaned with some kind of sanitizer before they can be delivered. So it's both very hard to get in physically and also get goods delivered digitally, and which means they just lost confidence in free market economy. So they just want to save more for potential uncertainty. People started to save money and to save as much as possible, try to avoid those kind of uncertainty in the future. And it just probably it results in a deflation. And the deflation had already been started a few years before. And the second thing I talked about is angst. That is in Heidegger's sense, that is the alienation from your inner self, from your awareness, from your self-awareness. Because when you basic needs are threat, when you basic living, when those living, when you can't get your basic needs met, like what's that kind of hierarchy? The five stuff, the very basic stuff is security and food, those things. When you can't even make sure you feel secured and make sure you can feed yourself, you just try to strive for as much as food as you can gather as possible and try to collect as much masks in your home as possible in order to make sure you can wear a mask outside. Therefore, you can go outside because if you don't have a mask, you cannot go outside. And all those things results in a so they just can't they just don't have the energy to focus on the inner self. They try to go with a mask, go with a policy, go with whatsoever outside themselves. And also, people lost physical contact. We lost huge amount of time and amount of possibilities to contact with each other, even close friends. For instance, from my personal experience, when I was in Nanjing in 2021, there was several cases founded in the Nanjing International Airport. And since when those cases were founded in that airport, I was also traveling to Nanking through that airport within several days of the period in that case was being found. And therefore, for all those people who had traveled to Nanking by airplane in this 14-day period, 7 days before cases identified and 7 days afterwards cases identified, all those people has to be quarantined. And one of my relatives also went to the airport in those 14 days. And their family members had also been quarantined. We just cannot contact with each other. And even after even those restrictions had lifted, we are just afraid once we contact each other, and later we discovered actually one of us had accidentally, unconsciously went to some places that afterwards a case had been identified. Then we had to self-quarantine ourselves. And therefore we just naturally castrated ourselves. We just do not want to make contact with each other, even as friends, even as relatives. And this kind of losing contact with each other is even more serious than losing contact with the nature, because humans are social animals. When you're thinking you're losing contact with the nature, naturally you're assuming that you are having contact with the people. But in that 3 years period, people just losing contact with the people. And it results in a deeper kind of fear that is angst. And that is so incredible self-damaging because it's just self castrating of physical contact, but also of mental thinking, that we are kept to be silent about our experience and kept to think back or lessons could be learned from those things, and therefore resulting in deeper depressed and alienated individuals in society.